Michael, hello. Thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm so looking forward to talking with you.
I'm so happy to have a chance to meet you and talk to you.
I know that you came from what you describe as the radical left, which is similar to me. I mean, oscillated between like identifying as a Marxist and a socialist for pretty much my whole life from the time I was a teenager. I had some interest in anarchism for a while and so on and so forth. But I I wonder if you could tell me a bit about your pivot. What were your past politics and what changed?
Sure. So I think that, my leftism was very much Gen X, 1980s, anti-apartheid movement, Central America, revolutionary socialist movements, drug policy reform, saving the environment. It was the beginning of climate advocacy in the 90s, end of the Cold War, kind of pushing back at the time on the left against the kind of Francis Fukuyama, we're all going to be one neoliberal world sort of stuff. But very much interested in a more heroic version of left-wing politics than today's victimhood-oriented left-wing politics. Very much more in the class socialist side of things. I was never Malthusian, meaning I was never somebody that thought there was too many people. Even so, I was more on the radical, more social side of the environmental movement. And then I started working on climate change. I would say I was always, now that I'm 51, you kind of learn more about yourself. I was always disagreeable as just sort of my personality, though I didn't have that awareness at the time. So I would find myself annoyed by various left-wing things. I mean, I was remembering that in the late 90s, I had a little communications shop that did advocacy campaigns for progressive causes. And I had some colleagues, friends come to me and really try to sell me on a diversity workshop on doing diversity trainings and racial sensitivity trainings. And I remember at the time being like, I'm sure I have some kind of baseline prejudices, but I'm not racist. And I understood racism was an ideology, that racism was something that you actually had to become indoctrinated into. And I was a Gen Xer, and, there was a period, I don't know how old you are, but there was definitely a time in the 90s when, and John McWhorter writes about this too in his book on woke racism, where, we were kind of like, I think we're all kind of over that stuff, and we can, we date whoever we want to date, and it's like race is not a big deal. But we were starting to see some of that really bad woke stuff start to show up in the 90s. But the issue that really ended up turning me away from the radical left, at least, was nuclear power, and discovering that nuclear power was not only not a demonic force, but was mostly a benevolent force. And of course, I'm speaking mostly of the energy source, but even the weapons turned out to be more complicated than I thought. And once you realize that nuclear power is good, not bad, that's such a radical thing in some ways, because nuclear was sort of the worst thing for a lot of people on the left since the 60s. So when you kind of go, wow, and also you realize the ways in which people were misleading you. It's not just that you were like, oh, it's just a gigantic misunderstanding, that there was these things that people were doing to mislead the public about nuclear power, suggesting that there was pollution going into the water. It's not the case. Slightly warmer water leaves nuclear plants, but it's clean water. The claims that were made particularly around Chernobyl, but the other accidents were just wrong. And the anti-nuclear activists were just clearly, if not lying explicitly, then being so misleading as to be, to leave anybody that kind of learned the truth about it going, wait, this is really wrong. And so then you have to kind of go, well, then how did I get it so wrong? How did everybody else get it so wrong? And then you start to get into really what became my book, Apocalypse Never, which is that what we call environmentalism is really a pretty radical anti-civilization ideology, that it opposed nuclear, which was the holy grail of environmental technologies in the 1950s. And that it was pursuing, pretty sinister things, including trying to deprive poor countries cheap energy. It was trying to make fertilizer unavailable to poor countries. trying to basically oppose the process of economic development around the world. And then that took 20 years, really. I mean, Apocalypse Never came out in 2020, but it's the culmination of 20 years of research and advocacy and writing. And then after that happened, then I decided to take on homelessness for a variety of reasons. And I was expecting that it was not the way that most progressives said it was, and was able to kind of document that and cover it. So it's sort of the changes I've made. One of them took a long time, is on the environment, and that accumulates in Apocalypse Never. And then one of them was much faster, and that culminated in San Francisco.
Yeah, I think it might be, I mean, for me in any case, you started to realize that, we were being duped as leftists in some way, or not necessarily duped, but I mean, I wasn't really
fine.
Okay. I mean, I'm wary of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but at the same time, when you start realizing what's being advocated on the left and being sold to us, like, as progressives, I don't identify as a progressive anymore, but as progressives, and then you start realizing that these policies and these ideas are not good. They don't help anything. They don't solve the problems they're claiming to be helping, and they're not, they're not good for people, which is weird, because I always thought, I'm a leftist because I care about people. Like, I care about the downtrodden. I care about the working class. I care about the poor. I care about women. I care about the disenfranchised in general. And the only possible reason that anybody could be right wing would be because they don't care about people. And I started to realize that wasn't exactly true. I mean,
yes. My views exactly.
Yeah, and so then you start to question everything, I think, is when you sort of start to realize that about one issue or some issues, you start to wonder, oh, well, what are these other policies about? But I mean, I want to talk a little bit more about environmentalism and what's leading that movement, because of course there's going to be a lot of people who are well-meaning and really want to save the world.
I mean, everybody. I mean, look, though, well, first of all, I'm excited to talk about this. I'm also, you may have seen that I've started writing on trans issues, which was not something I had on my bingo card for 2023. But now I'm like really interested in it. In fact, it's sort of the thing I'm most interested in. I'm also really interested in race, but I did do some of that in San Francisco. Trans, I stayed away from. I spent 2 years reading Abigail Schreier's books and works. I read her book twice. I've interviewed her twice, to the point where she was, I think, probably rightly annoyed with me that I was taking so long to finally do something, but we finally did. When you get something really wrong and then you take the time to get it right, I think there's a thing that often happens with former leftists where they just, I won't name any names, but some famous ones kind of go, I'm no longer on the left. Now I'm just a right winger. And it's like, are you sure?
Full MAGA.
Yeah, you just go full, and you kind of go, are you sure? I mean, like, have you really looked into it? Or is it just like, I'm not a Liverpool fan, I'm a Manchester City fan, let's go Manchester City. I mean,
like a full knee jerk, like you knee jerk in one direction, and then you're like, well, now I'm going way over here, and you're like, okay, well, there's more room.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also not, it's lazy a little bit, and I think it's also more comfortable because you want to find people that you agree with. But there's a bunch of issues that I hold pretty conventional liberal positions on, and that's sort of interesting. And then there's issues that I wasn't sure and needed to spend some time on. Like trans is a really, really important issue. I have a 17-year-old daughter. I've always been an advocate of gay rights, and married a same-sex couple, or hosted a marriage of same-sex couple friends of ours, and really think it's one of the most important liberation movements in the history of humankind. So the trans issue wasn't obviously wrong when you looked at it. It just started you started to look at it more and more, and we're like, I don't know that this is what it appears to be. But on the environment, in terms of the intentions, my view is basically everybody's good intentioned. I think Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were good intentioned. Hitler wanted what was best for Germany. I know I'm going to be quick. Shellenberger says Hitler wanted, but it's true, right? The genocide. The creation of what they called Lebensraum, living space, of clearing Poland of the Jewish communities. They were, he was like, I'm going to do this. This is going to be great for Germany, and he just, so the good intentions obviously is a terrible shorthand for evaluating somebody's politics. It's more like, and I think that in the sense that people that are trying to save the environment or people that are trying to work on climate change, they think that things like renewables are going to be better and that nuclear is bad. Now you start to get into the leadership of, well, let's take three of the big, I just kind of go, there's three big ones right now, right? Climate change, race, and trans. The general, your general progressives kind of go, if you're advocating for climate, you want to deal with climate. If you're advocating for Black Lives Matter, you want to save Black lives. If you're advocating on trans, you want to help trans kids. But you look at those movements just in the last 2 years, climate change movement has increased carbon emissions by shutting down nuclear plants and stopping natural gas production, because those are the things that replace coal. Black Lives Matter got at least we think 3,000 Black people killed by reducing police presence and demoralizing and demonizing police.
Right.
And the trans movement now appears to have a significant number, hundreds, maybe thousands of kids that would have aged out of their gender dysphoria, undergoing permanent puberty blocking and gender reassignment surgeries. And by the way, I'm such a chicken, just to indicate what a chicken I really am. I only really felt comfortable speaking out on the trans issue after this major book came out in Great Britain, which has caused this huge uproar, as you probably know, about the Tavistock clinic that was doing these surgeries, but also then Barry Weiss published the whistleblower from the St. Louis clinic. And it was like, boy, at that point, you're like, you have a major book by a former BBC reporter. You have an admitted scandal in Britain over this clinic. You have a whistleblower in the United States. And I went through both of those summaries, basically, and I just did a tweet thread where I just compared the British and the US cases, and it was like just identical. A rush to prescription, a rush to diagnosis, this menacing threat that, if you don't let your child transition, they're going to kill themselves. That is, I just was like, that is just struck me as absolute manipulation and crazy making as soon as I saw that. Yeah. So there's so many, but so you kind of go, just to back up, with these three big totemic woke positions, you see them hurting people and having the opposite of their intended effect. So definitely there are people at the tops of those movements who are narcissists and psychopaths who care only for themselves and don't care about the victims they create. And that's typical for victimhood movements in general. Mm. But it's also the case that the vast majority of people are just like, hey, I just think people should be able to, we should try to reduce carbon emissions. We should reduce police killing of Black people, and gay and lesbian and trans kids ought to be free to be who they are. And I think most of us go, yeah, those are things that we all want. But the agendas that are attached to climate, Black Lives Matter, and the trans movement are actually achieving the opposite of their intended outcome.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad that you explained that point, because I think that it's very easy for us, I'm sure that I've been guilty of this many times, to sort of vilify everyone who's on the opposing side of us. But I like to think that I'm not just I'm trying not to vilify people, but like who are on the opposing side, but because like the results are so bad, like in terms of, the trans issue, for example, there's real, tangible, negative, scary, harmful impacts on women and kids. I always feel, I've been talking about this and reading about this and writing about this for so long that I think you get to a point where I'm like, okay, yeah, blah, 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 I already know this. But when I read the whistleblower story that Barry Weiss published, I was just so repulsed. And it's so appalling that this is happening. And this is like, kids' lives are being ruined. Like it's a really big deal. And the way that critics are treated is so appalling, because it's so glib and dismissive, and obviously people are written off as bigots and transphobes. And similarly in the way that people are written off when they're critical of responses to climate change.
Yep.
They're called a climate change denialist. This is applicable in all sorts of areas, but I guess in terms of that issue, I'm curious to know, do you think that, is climate change an actual problem? Is there an actual danger there?
Yeah, I mean, my basic view of climate change is that climate change is real. It's mostly caused by humans. We have good science on it. I basically agree with most of what's called Working Group 1 of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is sort of the kind of physical reality of climate change. I also, it's not the end of the world. It's not even, for me, it's not the biggest environmental problem in the world. The biggest environmental problem in the world remains land use, I think, in terms of having enough habitat for endangered species, and conventional air pollution, which already shortens the lives of 6 million people. But poverty, forest destruction, wood fuel use, which causes the worst forms of pollution, these are all just the same thing. The people that are pushing into the forests are using the worst fuels. They're living the most impoverished life. And so the main event remains economic development and resilience. All else being equal, we wouldn't want to change the temperature of the earth very much. On the other hand, there's 8 billion humans, and we have a big environmental impact. And so feeding and clothing 8 billion humans while trying to leave some room for endangered species is a huge challenge. Climate change is something. The other thing to know about climate change is that we've been going in the right direction. The last decade, carbon emissions globally have been basically flat. They even slightly declined a little bit. We've been doing that by moving towards cleaner sources of energy. The two most important ones are natural gas and nuclear. So without the climate change movement, we had this thing called the fracking revolution, which allowed for the cheap extraction of natural gas from underground. And we also had nuclear power. Neither of these technologies were created to deal with environmental problems, but both of them are the keys to driving down carbon emissions. By contrast, the climate movement, in the form of Greta Thunberg and Al Gore and John Kerry and all the usual suspects, are adamantly against natural gas. They're adamantly against nuclear. They've actually been shutting down nuclear plants, stopping natural gas. And so the result is that we burned more coal last year. So my views of the environment are, in some ways, it's a very simple picture, which is that we should move to cleaner sources of energy, and we should fight back against anybody who wants to use climate change as an excuse for people to stay in poverty. Over time, emissions will come down, and we're also just getting so much better at surviving natural disasters. I always point out that on the two issues that I work on, climate change and drugs, the mortality just doesn't even compare. We had like 300 or so deaths from natural disasters in the United States on average in a given year. It varies between 200 and 500 or so. That's like nothing. I mean, it's like literally like hardly. I mean, we don't know anybody that dies in a hurricane. You know what I mean? You're never like, whereas like drugs are killing over 100,000 Americans right now. That number has increased from 17,000 just 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So when you kind of go relative importance, climate is so out of bounds with the levels with which it matters. It certainly doesn't require these radical interventions into the economy that progressives are making. And I think renewables have a bunch of terrible environmental impacts that we're not really dealing with. So my concern is definitely more on the side of being concerned about the negative consequences of climate policy at this point than I am with the consequences of climate change.
And what do you think about responses? Like in Canada, who knows if this will actually happen or not? It's hard to tell who's just virtue signaling to, gain support or if they're actually serious. But, Trudeau and the Liberal Party suggested an electric car mandate where they're trying to basically get to a point where only electric cars are produced. This is, like 10 years down the line. But, to get cars that aren't electric cars off the road. And, I like my old truck. My concerns aren't limited just to that issue, but I'm skeptical that that's a viable solution to start or even a good one.
It wouldn't be, I mean, so the way to think about we call it decarbonizing energy, which is reducing the carbon intensity of energy sources. The easiest things to do is to just replace all of your electricity generation with nuclear power. You're Canadian. Canadians actually are more comfortable with nuclear than other people. French are very comfortable. Americans, we're in the middle, but that's sort of the easiest way, is you just replace how you generate electricity. Then the next thing would be to replace your natural gas and cooking and heating with electricity. And there's some efforts to do that, but they're trying to do it with solar. And that obviously doesn't work when people are cooking at night or when it's cloudy. So nuclear just remains kind of the main event in terms of that. Transportation is much harder because these electric cars, they're amazing. Some of them are amazing. I actually just drove a Tesla for the first time, and it was an incredible at accelerating. Anybody that's ever been in one knows how heavy they are. So you've got a lot of mining and materials that are going through it. It's all being done in China. They take the minerals from South America and Africa. They ship them to China. China refines them in these huge coal-powered factories. That's also how they make their solar panels. So electric cars and solar are not nearly as clean as people think they are, in part because they're just made from coal, and coal is the dirtiest fuel, the dirtiest fossil fuel. And now there's a huge push to mandate electric cars. And the short answer is we don't really know what's going to happen with supply chains. Are they going to be able to keep up with the demand for all the lithium and cobalt and nickel that's required for these technologies? Or are you going to, basically it's going to take a lot longer, or is it really the future in hydrogen? For many years, they thought that cars would be powered by hydrogen fuel cells. And that would be there's a lot of reasons why physically that's a superior way to do it than with lithium, which is just such a heavy substance. So anytime your vehicles are becoming heavier, you're actually going in the wrong direction. You would actually want to go towards vehicles that would be lighter, because they're more energy efficient, they're more power intensive. So the short answer is we don't know, because societies, the bottom line is we're so rich as societies that we just subsidize these expensive sources of energy, and we all experience more expensive electricity and vehicles. So the short answer is I'm not sure what's going to happen. I basically don't agree that we should have heavy mandates to get there. I would support some amount of money for R&D, but yeah, you'll be able to you should be able to keep your truck for a year. I drove a 2002 Honda Accord, by the way, and it's sort of like people are like, oh, it's better to get a Tesla. It's like, well, it's not better to get a Tesla to replace a 2002 car, because the car itself requires a lot of energy to make. And why are you just you can drive cars for a really long time, and there's this idea that you have to be constantly replacing your car.
Yeah.
Is a part of the original criticism of consumer culture.
Yeah, it's like trash culture. It's the same thing with our phones and our laptops, right? Like you have to throw it away every couple of years and get a new one, and it creates so much garbage. It's super wasteful.
Yeah.
I have a 95 F-150, and it's awesome. And you can just keep replacing the parts and fixing the parts forever. As long as you take good care of it, right? It's super sustainable in a lot of ways. But what
is true environmentalism? That's also my vision of nuclear power plants. Mostly they can just have parts replaced over time. And a society that moves towards maintenance is a good society. It's also creating a class of people that are involved in repairing things rather than digging up the earth to create new things.
Yeah, for sure. And it creates, you have more autonomy at the same time. It's strange. Not that long ago, I don't know how to do this myself, but I know people who can. I have friends, you used to be able to kind of take apart your laptop and fix things and replace things, like get a better hard drive, yada, yada, yada. And now, of course, you can't even take it apart yourself. You're completely reliant on these huge corporations. And it seems like a lot about environmentalism is about sort of the elites of the world, like the people who are most hyperbolic about climate change and environmentalism tend to be urban elites. Like they tend to be people like my friends in Vancouver, in other words, people who think that we need to, for example, I mean, I'm not sure how involved in this issue you have been, but the idea of lab grown meat replacing actual cow meat, like plant-based meat products instead of again, beef or chicken and so on and so forth, because they think that's a more sustainable solution. A lot of it, and a lot of the panic around it, like our kids, we aren't going to have a world for our kids. Why do you think it is that it's the people who sort of have the most privilege in the world, in the grand scheme of things, who are the most obsessed with environmentalism and climate change hyperbole?
Well, and woke, the whole woke religion, the full woke religion. I mean, with trans,
right?
For me, I was like, so my friend Peter Boghossian and I after I read John McWhorter's Woke Racism book. So Woke Racism comes out the exact same time as San Fransicko. I was flying to New York to do a book event with John, and I was reading Woke Racism, and he says this is a religion. It's just and he sort of describes how it's a religion. And so I just pulled out my notebook and I just created along the top a bunch of religious categories, original sin, guilty devils, foundational myths, kind of the taboos, and I'd kind of go through, and I did it. I started creating a list, and Peter and Abigail and other people kind of helped me fill it out. And sure enough, it was easy to fill out. It took us a few weeks, but kind of everything, it was like, oh, well, that's that. And, we went through rituals and just the whole thing. And so I wrote an article called Why Wokeism is a Religion. And it's clearly very strong. It's much stronger among it's just, we know who it is, right? It's educated elites. Yeah. These are people who tend to be more secular, tend to be atheist. And there's just a very large body of psychological research that goes back decades that I think is very persuasive, showing that that people need religion, they need a faith, and they need some sense of transcendent purpose, meaning, or what we call an immortality project. It's sort of most famous by like putting your name on a building if you're a rich guy donating to Harvard or something, but we all need it. It's like why your parents are so happy when they see the grandkids, like, all my grandkids, I'm going to live forever, or there's my DNA, it's so, and that's a very sweet and natural response to awareness of your death. But I think if you say, oh, I don't believe in any of that, I'm just we're going to be worm food, and we're just like other animals, and our thoughts and our feelings are just, the excretion of organs. They don't mean anything. There's no point to this shit. You're just going to die and forget about it. I think that's really unsatisfying for people, and that they end up constructing covert religious dogmas as a psychological reaction. So I think that's really what's going on. Now, there's always money involved. There's people that make money selling solar panels. There's people that make money selling puberty blockers, and there's people that make money selling diversity workshops.
Yeah.
There's all, and that's true. At the same time, everything has money involved to some extent. So it's not exactly, I don't think it's that deepest cause. I think another cause is power, and that if you agree with many psychologists and many philosophers, humans want power. They want meaning and purpose, but they want to feel power and control over their environments. And there's ways in which each of these discourses in politics on race, climate, and trans are ways for people to gain power. So if you just look at in the media, for example, you see younger, hyper woke people forcing out of their organizations older, less woke liberals, frankly, using wokeism as a way to drum out the older people and make room for the younger people. That's the Peter Turchin has this idea of the overproduction of elites. We just have too many educated people competing for limited jobs. So I think all these things are motivations. You see younger people using these ideologies, certainly since the 60s, to gain power over older people. You also see it being used to gain power politically. Prime Minister of Scotland, or Pete Buttigieg, or Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris became VP because she called Joe Biden a racist in that first debate, and he just couldn't have that. And he's been it just kind of, I'm going to have a black woman this, I'm going to have a black woman that. I think it's totally patronizing and racist, like John McWhorter says, but it obviously works. One of the publications I'm really into right now, it's this minor obsession, is this publication called Compact. And they've been publishing these really good essays on wokeism. And they just did one today by this guy, Zizek. He's a kind of weird psychoanalytical communist philosopher.
Yeah, I'm aware of him. He's very strange.
Yeah, he's very strange. But he sort of had this piece today where he kind of goes, psychoanalytically, you're looking at, because you kind of go, why? Because everybody kind of hates it. There's a hardcore woke, but when the woke leave the room, everyone's kind of like, God, that guy's a fucking shit. It's like, God, thank God, I don't want to have to do any more of those workshops. You'll just hate it, because it's it's terrible. They sit around and talk about how terrible you are, So what is it? And I think part of it is that with wokeism, you just get this complete religion. With climate change, you get this alternative apocalypse. With race, you get this alternative way to feel guilty to replace original sin.
Right.
And with trans, this was Abigail's contribution. All credit to Abigail. It took a year, because I asked her a year ago what the trans kind of, how it was a religion, and she goes, it's an alternative soul. I'm truly this other gender, outside of my body is just lying to you. Like I'm this other thing. It's a spiritual quest. And so there's all the kind of the fervency of religion, but then Zizek was also like, it's also just that, and I think this is the same thing as saying it's guilt. He says it's like a kind of overabundant or over-empowered superego, where the superego in Freudian psychoanalysis is the thing in you that's like, don't have sex with that person, or don't eat that chocolate donut, or be nice to your neighbors. Like that sort of, the good voice, the mature voice, but it goes kind of crazy and it starts to want to dominate and run roughshod over everybody else.
Well, and a big part of the problem with the woke religion and, the new left, the modern left, not the 60s new left, is that it's amoral. So, I remember for many, many, many years, what I did in terms of my feminist podcasts and commentary and journalism and stuff like that was advocating for the Nordic model, advocating against the legalization of prostitution, talking about the porn industry. And every time I would talk about porn and prostitution, I would be accused by leftists of being moralistic. And I think at the beginning I rejected that because I grew up in a household that was not religious at all, and in fact really opposed to organized religion. So I guess I never even thought about it as an identity, but I suppose I would be agnostic. But at a certain point I was like, wait a minute, is having morals a bad thing? Why are you behaving as though having morals and ethics is something that's undesirable? And then it's sort of like, well, no wonder these people have come to a place, although of course horrible things have been done in the name of religion too, where kind of anything goes. I mean, in terms of the prostitution debate and the porn conversation, the left's approach is really based solely on consent, and consent is very narrow in their minds. So if there's payment, then there's consent, if the woman agrees, if it's two consenting adults, then everything's above board, and we don't need to have any other conversation about this around ethics, around morals. And so much of that is a rejection of religion. But of course, as we've discussed, these ideologies are also very, very religious. And
I think the sex work one is worth talking a little bit about.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, it's a mystery. Why, for people that are obsessed with victimhood ideology, why would you not see women? And we've been writing about. I think you saw on our Twitter, we wrote about a 14-year-old girl that we got off the street.
Yeah.
Now, you get to a 14-year-old girl and there's no debate, so even the most woke people are on board with getting 14-year-old girls off the street. But what about an 18-year-old girl who, let's say, was sexually, abused by her father or her uncle and got hooked on drugs, and now she's on the street? Why would the woke not want to rescue that person or have the John or the pimp arrested? That seems like a contradiction, because you say you care about victims. Here's this young black female prostitute, you call sex worker. How could you possibly say that she's there on her own free will? And I think that the answer is that rescuing that girl requires the use of law enforcement against the pimps and the Johns. And these guys are against law enforcement. They're just against the police. They have a view of the police that's very similar to how environmentalists view nuclear power. It's just a demonic force. It should be abolished. The criminal justice system is not something that can be reformed. It should be eliminated. And when you get to I've had this conversation, well, what would you do if you don't have the police? Oh, there'd be community, da 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 da, and some, it sounds like a lot of meetings. It's like recalls the hymn talks about. Would have been a socialist, but there's too many meetings. I mean, we're just going to have like meetings and like sing-alls with trying to get like the pimps to stop trafficking and chemically enslaved girls. I mean,
and it's all voluntary. Like what the solution they're offering are unpaid positions. The solutions offered to me in terms by like leftists and anarchists and so on and so forth to this abolish the police mantras are like, oh yeah, the community would take care of it. We're just essentially relying on the good of people in the community. And by people, I think we have to say men, because who else is going to be the enforcer? It's going to be men, not women, realistically. And those men are inevitably going to be the same men, not all men, but some of them are going to be the same men who are domestic abusers or rapists or exploiters themselves. Like there's no real accountability system there. And yeah, I mean, that anti-criminalization argument has been around for some time now, and I think it's quite irrational.
Yeah, though I think it's irrational, but I do think it's also a morality in the sense that it's saying something, it's making broad generalizations about what's good and bad. I have an essay I haven't finished yet, or I sort of written it, but it's kind of like the headline was something like, the reason they're pro-crime is because they're anti-capitalism.
Right.
Where you kind of go like, well, they think that capitalism and Western civilization more broadly is the problem. And they, there's all sorts of things that seem like they're contradictions, but they kind of go, capitalism is the problem and the police are the problem. And so I'm against anything that involves using the police. And that includes addiction, by the way, and homeless, and saying you have to enforce the laws in part to get people the care they need if you're addicted to drugs or you're mentally ill, but they're against that. I had another one that was really tricky. That was somebody was like, if they're so libertarian, because we think that they're left libertarians, which is a kind of anarchism. And it's different than it's different than the old school socialism. But I had people ask me, say, if they're such left libertarians, then why are they always trying to impose vaccines and masks on everybody? And the answer, I think, and I think we've worked it out, is that those things are being imposed on everybody, including the oppressor class, to protect the victims, whereas they perceive the pimps and the drug dealers as victims and the police as the bad guys. I'll give you an example. Like this is actually a really good example. It's an evidence for this case, which is that in California, the governor signed legislation by a San Francisco senator to abolish the prohibition on loitering with the intent to solicit prostitution, which is basically a way to prevent street prostitution, or what we call street walking. The justification was that the police were harassing and harming sex workers. But if you know anything about sex work, and obviously you do, you study this, longer than I have, but you go like the people that are victimizing the sex workers are the pimps and the johns, not the police.
Yeah.
But the assumption is that the police are the perpetrators, and it's the exact same thing on homicides. Many, it was like 20 or 30 unarmed black guys were killed by the police in 2022. And that's 30 more people than should be killed, blah, blah, blah. But it's against the backdrop of 8,000 black homicides, black deaths from homicide. Like, clearly, police are not the main event when it comes to black deaths. So I think a lot of people, conservatives and liberals alike, that are critical of Black Lives Matter kind of go, yeah, that's so weird. Why don't Black Lives Matter? Why doesn't it care about all the black lives lost to civilians as opposed to police? And it's like, well, because Black Lives Matter doesn't really give a shit about black lives. What it really cares about is tearing down capitalist Western civilization. And so what you see in each of these woke movements are basically what we used to call radical left. You can call them progressive, call them woke. People that are cosplaying or LARPing, I'm learning all the language, they're playing like, I'm an environmentalist, I'm a civil rights activist, I'm a advocate for sex workers, I'm a trans activist. No, you're not. You just fucking hate civilization because you're in this totally radical mentality, and now you're going out and gaining some expertise in a field in order to demand things that actually neither solve the problem and actually make it worse.
Yeah.
That's what's really going on. And it's called the long march through institutions, or sometimes it's called cultural Marxism, though I think that wrongly reduces it to class, because Marxism was mostly about class. And this stuff is just aiming to be, to quote unquote dismantle institutions and structures of oppression without any regard that those structures might actually be protecting the people that they claim they want to protect.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I don't think that most of these people have the intention to destroy civilization. I mean, in a way they do, because they'll say smash the patriarchy, smash capitalism, like destroy these institutions. But I suppose what they think is that there'll be a revolution, and what will come out of this will be much better. This civilization will match the ideas in their head, despite the fact these civilizations have never existed before. And there's probably a reason for that.
And efforts to create them have been horrible and resulted in millions of deaths.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to some extent, the leaders definitely think that they are creating a new society and that they are going to overthrow. I mean, the hardcore leaders, like in each of these movements, definitely have a really radical anti-civilization agenda. But they can sweep up I'm in Berkeley Hills, or you were in Vancouver. I mean, all the people with the Black Lives Matter signs in the yards and their houses that are worth $2 million, and they drive Teslas.
Yeah.
They don't want to lose civilization. They're the winners.
No, imagine fighting to smash capitalism when you're so much more wealthy than most people in the country, and you've had so many more advantages, like in terms of education and, social power, political power, so on and so forth. I mean, you have a voice, which is a lot. Most people don't have that kind of voice. Most people don't have these platforms. I mean, what you said around Black Lives Matter, not really caring about Black lives, I thought was true and interesting, because this idea of abolishing the police really, really hurts, again, women. I mean, there's so much domestic violence that happens in these communities. Domestic violence happens everywhere, but there's a lot of domestic violence that happens in poor communities, where there's a lot of crime that's going on. And who are these women supposed to call if there's no cops?
No, I mean, in my neighborhood, if one of my neighbors with a Black Lives Matter sign in the front of the yard calls 911 and they don't get a cop car up here within minutes, there will be action taken at the city council level like that. But they are demanding, they're supporting a group that has demanded the defunding of police, and where police have been defunded, demoralized, and ultimately intimidated into not policing are in Black communities. It's in the communities that need the police the most. So it's really quite sick. I don't think it's a conspiracy by white people to hurt Black people at all. I think it's definitely like well-meaning, but I don't think you get any, in my book, you don't get any points at all for being well-meaning, because I just think I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and is like, I'm going to go hurt people today.
Yeah.
They wake up being like, I'm a good person and there's nothing bad in me, but my opponents are all evil. I've been interested in narcissism, in rising narcissism in the culture, which is something that's been talked about quite a bit, certainly even since the 70s. But one of the things I've learned is that narcissism is characterized by thinking in black and white. You're either all with me or you're all against me. I mean, if you think about people in your life who are drama queens like that, well, if you don't support me on everything I do, then you're
a bad friend. Like,
you're bad. And
yeah,
it's also the purifying. I'm all good. My intentions are I'm all about saving Black, trans, climate, whatever.
Yeah.
And if you don't support that, then you're just a terrible person and you want to destroy the world and you deny the reality of climate apocalypse and blah, 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 blah. That's narcissism. I mean, it's a stunted morality in some ways. It's the morality of a child who doesn't think it's possible to have other views and still be a good person, or so these behavior, it's really those three things. It's grandiosity, entitlement, and they call splitting. That's the black and white stuff. And those are the three parts of narcissism. And you see it in each of these movements, the entitlement, the grandiosity, the splitting, a surefire sign that we're dealing with something psychopathological.
Yeah, and that so much of it is superficial, and of course about virtue signaling on the internet, which gains you, social power and these likes and these dopamine hits that you need and desire to feel like you are righteous. And I mean, so do you think that there actually is a rise of narcissism in the culture? I mean, I think there is, but it's hard to tell because what we see on social media looks a lot like narcissism everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Like, my wife and I have been we've been into like watching old movies, and just all the classics, and just going through the, top 100 movies. And, and we just, there's some where like, there's like narcissists portrayed in the movies, like All About Eve is just this incredible movie. I'd never seen it before. And it's got Joan Crawford in it. And it's about actors, and so like clearly, like, and the narcissists are so clearly drawn in this movie that you're like, well, obviously, it's back then. But so many of the things you see, or when I talk to my mom and her aunt and her sisters, who grew up on a farm, and I talk to my extended family that are not media people, and they work in farming or they work in manual labor. I mean, they're really different on this. They're not entitled. They don't engage in this kind of narcissistic splitting or grandiosity that people that, more progressive, urban, educated elites engage in. I definitely think it is. I don't know that we have any good hard quantitative measures of it, but it seems like, and then I just think it was happening already just because we get, some of it's okay, right? Like, when you get richer, you have fewer kids and you spoil them. So coddling has been going on. Coddling children has been going on for, at least 150 years. I mean, they were, Rousseau advocated coddling 250 years ago, right? In his famous book on child rearing, I think it's called Emile. And so it's been going on for a long time, but then social media has absolutely intensified narcissism. I mean, I see people that I know are not narcissistic and are really far from being narcissistic in real life, doing things on social media that strike me as narcissistic, just in order to just be on social media. Mm-hmm. So some of this, I think, is just a function of the change to media, and then I think some of it is a longer term trend related to rising prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly incentivized on social media. It's almost hard to operate on social media without behaving a little bit like a narcissist.
Yeah.
The whole point of putting something out there on Twitter, for example, is that you get a bunch of likes and retweets. So it's like,
yeah,
you're right. Yeah, you.
and it's not all bad. I mean, and I think, I'm really influenced by this who I think is the world expert on narcissism, a guy named Sam Vaknin, who is a self-diagnosed narcissist. Like he says I'm a narcissist, and that's part of why he's such an expert. And he describes his own life, and he thinks narcissism, personality disorder, which is like the really extreme narcissist, that it's a response to stress and to abuse when you're a child. So it's not a psychopathy is thought to be actually physically in the brain, but narcissism appears to be a stress response. And but he points out, he's like, you can't do anything about it, and this kind of gets this other point I was going to make, which is that, like, I think in dismantling wokeism, it's not enough to just morally condemn it. You have to describe what it's doing psychologically to people in as specific and precise a way as possible. That's why we're involved in creating this taxonomy of woke psychology, to kind of describe, hey, when Black Lives Matter does this, or when climate activists do this, or when trans activists do this, this is consistent with what we know about narcissism or what we know about psychopathy. Similarly, I think that it can go in the positive direction. So I'm involved in two grassroots social movements, one around conservation and one around homelessness. And the thing everybody wants and needs and deserves that's doing this work, that's in my coalition, is recognition. So the difference between bad narcissistic supply, in my view, and justified recognition is that the latter is something you earn. You worked really hard to put together a protest, or to do an article, or you organized a coalition, or you wrote a book, or you have a podcast or something, and you get some recognition. I loved that, and well earned, and that's, you might call it a healthy narcissism. You might say but it's justified. We should be recognized when we work hard and achieve something important, or behave with courage, and intelligence. We should not be recognizing people for things that they're not responsible for. And similarly, we should not be scapegoating people, police officers, or nuclear power plant workers. Yeah. Trying to figure out ones in each of my categories. Police officers, psychologists who actually push back against gender dysphoria, we should not be scapegoating and demonizing these people. And I think that these dysfunctional behaviors, both of giving, the kind of gross, what is it? Is it supplicants? It's like the obsequiousness, where it's always like, oh God, you're a famous, beautiful Black actress. Oh my God. Oh, applause, applause, applause. It's like, she's just an actress.
Didn't do anything.
You're gorgeous. And like, I mean, it's like AOC.
Yeah, but you don't have to do anything to be beautiful, really. No, I mean, you maybe stay in shape, I suppose.
Yeah. I see AOC. I watched this congressional hearing on the Twitter files a couple weeks ago, and there's AOC, just here she is, like drop dead gorgeous. She could be a model. She's maybe one of the most popular people in political life in the United States, certainly on the left.
Yeah.
She's incredibly articulate, very bright. And here she is, just attacking her colleagues to their faces as racists and conspiracy theorists and dumb hicks, and just kind of putting them down. And I just remember being like, and the whole time complaining, claiming some kind of victimhood mantle. I thought it was just grotesque. I just thought this is malignant narcissism in overdrive, and people should be able to see that, and we should expose that and explain what it is. And in a way, as harsh as what I just said was, you can kind of go, look, you may not be a narcissist, but those behaviors that you're engaging in are really pathological and destructive, and you should stop doing those. Because I do think even AOC has the potential to be a force for good, and we should remember that when we think of our opponents, that it's really the things we want to condemn are the behaviors, not the people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting how few people do recognize narcissism, and not only do they not recognize narcissism, but they reward it. I mean, when AOC behaves in that way, which I think is repulsive and really unattractive, I don't mean on a superficial level, but just in terms of me liking a person or wanting to hear what they have to say, You know, and then on the other hand, there's clearly tons and tons of people who love it. And I'm
Oh,
not
for
quite sure.
sure. And they get something out of it, right? I mean, this, like, there's been a phenomenon that's been written about about kind of white guys. I mean, you see it with both white men and white women that are very woke, kind of putting down white people.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and it's supposedly self-hatred, but it's actually a kind of self-love and self-admiration because they want to be rewarded and applauded for insulting ostensibly themselves. These are very pathological kinds of behaviors that I think we should draw attention to and expose. It's not totally clear how to do it because, I mean, that's what Zizek was writing about, is that you kind of go, if these people are so obnoxious and everybody kind of hates what they're doing, why do they retain so much cultural power? You know, and of course, as soon as, you know, the proverbial Ed Murrow goes, "Have you no decency?" You know, as soon as somebody stands up to the bully, you know, usually it takes a couple people, but as soon as you stand up to the bullies reveal themselves to be cowards and back down. You know, so I do think this process whereby some of us that are in the anti-woke, you know, we've been calling us the normies, the coalition of the normies, the anti-woke normies. You know, I think when we find each other and find these connections and engage in a kind of shared, you know, pushback that's also kind of therapeutic in nature. You know, if you can be loving about it. I'm a Christian, and for me, being a Christian means taking very seriously the axiom that you should love thy neighbors, which is extremely radical political philosophy. Sorry, love thy enemies, even more radical. Hard enough to love your neighbors.
Yeah.
If you can love your enemies and kind of go, yeah, you know, AOC, you're a good person, you've got good intentions. It's absolutely wrong for you to demonize your opponents as racists and transphobes. That's not what's going on. And those kinds of behaviors are really destructive and really diminish you. If we're able to do that, I think it's very powerful and world changing, and also helps us to break out of this kind of endless cycle of revenge and retribution that we're in.
Yeah, I think that you're probably right. I certainly haven't mastered that ability myself, and I do try to stop myself from insulting people and labeling people. I think that's something that I used to do quite a bit as like a knee-jerk position as like a younger radical feminist, and you go around calling everybody a misogynist who disagrees with you. And at a certain point I was like, okay, well, these people aren't all misogynists, and I know that in many ways because these people are my actual friends, and it's hard to explain that to people who are immersed in this kind of dogma. Again, I'm just speaking about feminism because this is something that I had a lot of experience with. But you know, when I started to try to tell other feminists, other radical feminists, you know, like, you can't just dehumanize everyone who disagrees with you. Like, this guy, you know, like, if you genuinely want men to stop using porn or whatever it is, you're not going to do that by like screaming at him on the internet and calling him a rapist and a misogynist. You know, like, lots of regular normal guys engage in these things, and they're not all bad people. And you saying that they're all bad people, isn't true and doesn't help. And then, you know, like, I would get in trouble for saying that, because then it's like, oh, well, you're sympathizing with rapists, right? Then I get like labeled in that way too. And but it's not a successful tactic.
What it seems like you're famous in part because you were bounced from Twitter for using wrong pronouns.
Yeah.
And this is something that I haven't really looked so much time into, but it seems like, let's take an extreme case. The guy in Scotland, I'm saying right there, the guy in Scotland who gets convicted of rape and then says, "Oh, I'm actually a woman."
Yeah.
In that case, aren't we justified to say him in that situation? Or do you and in what situation would you say, like, Caitlyn Jenner? So it kind of goes, on one end, you would be like, well, that person we can say is a man. We're going to use his male pronoun. But Caitlyn Jenner, do you say Caitlyn Jenner, is she and a woman? What do you say? Or do you say a trans woman?
I'm pretty committed to using, to correctly sexing people. So if you're male, even if you identify as a trans woman or woman, I'm most likely to use the pronoun he, and vice versa for a woman who's identifying as a man or a trans man. And it's not to be mean, but because I feel like there's broader harms and negative implications for going along with this pronoun stuff. And we can see this in more obvious ways in terms of, for example, when we're talking about a violent male rapist, murderer, whatever, who is reported on in the news as though he's a woman. I think this could have really harmful impacts in terms of data, like who's perpetrating crimes against women. Is it men or is it women? Like, when we go along with this, he's a she because he says so, and that's the polite thing to do. I think there's a whole host of implications that we're seeing play out right now in terms of men being transferred into women's prisons, but also in terms of men, competing in sports as women against other women, men being allowed access to women's transition has change rooms because you have to be polite and you have to respect their identity and so on and so forth. So, and I also honestly, I don't really see the purpose in using the pronoun she to refer to a male, because it's not like you're saying he to insult somebody. It's just your sex. I mean, be whoever you want to be. Okay, so you don't like your body. You don't identify with these gender stereotypes. That's fine. You want to call yourself Sarah. Okay. Calling you he isn't me attacking you. It's just the biology. And I think that's how we should treat it. Like, it's not a judgment.
Right. Now, what about Caitlyn Jenner? If Caitlyn Jenner were here and you said, and you referred to Caitlyn as a he, and Caitlyn was like, "Hey, please don't call me he. I'm a trans woman." Would you just be like, "Fuck you, I'm gonna call you he," or what would you do?
I wouldn't say fuck you. I mean, if I was in a one-on-one situation with a trans identified person and I was like having a coffee with them, I don't think the pronouns matter so much in that situation, because it's not about me. That person, I'm sure on some level, unless they're completely insane, knows if they're male or female. But I think in a public setting, certainly in a journalistic setting, certainly in terms of things like IDs and data collection and so on and so forth, I think it does matter. So yeah, if it was a one-on-one thing with me and Caitlyn Jenner, maybe I would just say she, because who really cares in that situation? But when I'm speaking publicly, I don't want to go along with it or pretend that it doesn't matter or encourage people. I almost feel like it's a sort of gaslighting. Like, you're like, oh, well, she's doing this, she's doing that. And people are like, wait a minute, isn't that a man? And it's like, oh, no, well, it's confusing beyond all of the
gaslighting is the right
word.
What about is it? And do you think that most trans women, or at least a large percentage of it, is autogynephilia? Is that right?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, there's research that was done on this by Ray Blanchard, I believe, that found, and this is a bit old now, so there might have been changes since then, but what he found was that the men who transitioned sort of when they were young men, before they were like 18, 19 kind of thing, were in general gay guys, who were maybe grew up in like a homophobic family, or were, living in a homophobic culture and maybe felt that it would be easier, they'd be more successful if they were women, or just didn't know how to parse the fact that they didn't feel masculine and maybe they were interested in more stereotypically feminine things. And then the men who transition more in middle age, like 40s, 50s, 60s, were pretty much all autogynephilic, so had some kind of fetish around cross-dressing or imagining themselves as women going out in public dressed as women.
Yeah.
And I do think that if you look at what a lot of these guys are doing and sort of how they describe why they are wearing women's clothes and what they think about being a woman is, they'll talk about being objectified, and they'll like that kind of like porny sexualization, or they'll even talk about having like tried on their mother or sister's underwear and, you know, weird things like that, feeling sort of like turned on when they put on pantyhose. And, you know, that's been something we aren't supposed to talk
they're
about.
Gay, right? So they're not also, they're attracted to men, not women, right? They're sexually attracted to men, not women, but yet they're getting sexual, they're gaining sexual thrill from wearing women's clothes. So it sounds like the way it works is, if I'm understanding correctly, that they are imagining that they are sexy like a woman is to men. Is that correct?
I think, yeah, I mean, in some ways, but I also think that there's a lot of the autogynephilic men who remain heterosexual. You know, like I've talked to women who were in relationships with men who are married to men who got interested in so-called tranny porn. This is how they referred to it. Or got into cross-dressing, and then eventually that turned into, I want to transition, I'm actually a woman. And I don't think that was necessarily because they turned gay. But you're right. I mean, it's something about objectification. A lot of it seems like sort of a self-objectification, like a getting turned on by seeing yourself as a woman, which sounds like maybe a confusing concept when I'm explaining it out loud. But I know that a lot of the older guys are not gay, that they remain heterosexual. A lot of them expect their wives to stick around throughout all this. Or, you know, Caitlyn Jenner transitioned and then was dating like a young woman.
Oh, really? I did not know that. Okay.
So, yeah, but it is a lot of it is fetishistic.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's going on is how the left, the woke left, has been using psychiatric disorders and worsening psychiatric disorders. You know, when I read Abigail's book, she said, what other psychiatric disorder is affirmed in the ways that gender dysphoria is affirmed? And I was like, oh, I have one. Because she was like, there's no other psychiatric disorder that's affirmed. And I was like, yeah, there is one. It's called substance use disorder.
Right.
Which is drug addiction. And it is affirmed by the woke left in San Francisco. I wrote a book about it. And it's like identical. And it's also, it's motivated, you know, the affirmation of trans or gender dysphoria by trans activists is about affirming a supposedly authentic self, you know, or what Abigail refers to as like the soul, you know, a view of the soul. For addicts, it's being affirmed because they think it would be cruel to stage an intervention and get people into recovery from addiction. But it also appears to be somewhat motivated out of a really strong desire to take care of people. So they have different motivations, but I'm struck that the left has become or the radical left, the woke left has become, predatory almost, you know, if I have to use a word for it, in the sense of preying on vulnerable psychiatrically distressed or disordered people who are, you know, maybe in a phase. I mean, I think the research suggests that most of these girls suffering from sudden onset gender dysphoria, if you just left them alone, would age out of it. And some significant share might become lesbians or not, you know. And similarly, you know, people recover from addiction, you know, but it's important to be like, it's important for family and friends, and ultimately, if they fail, for not because they're you know, no blame on them, but if they're not able to rescue their loved ones from addiction, it falls on the society to say you can't sleep on the street in your addiction, and we're going to mandate care for you.
Yeah, it's interesting that addiction has become this thing that's treated as like an incurable disease.
Yes. Yes. Because they want it to be. I mean, this is a really harsh thing to say. And I mean, I'm not even saying it's conscious, but it is like when I argue with people about this, they go, well, it's just, Michael, you're just so naive. I mean, it's just people don't, I'm trying to capture the patronizing quality of their voice.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know anything about this topic.
I mean, Michael, you're just a dumbass. But it's really hard. And I'm like, yeah, and you interview addicts and they're like, yeah, I relapsed, a dozen times. And ultimately I quit because I was worried about going to jail or having my kids taken from me or losing their jobs. I mean, one of the most interesting things I discovered, we don't talk about it enough, is that medical doctors have the highest rate of recovery from addiction of any profession. And because doctors, they're always dabbling in their drugs. Doctors are huge druggies, and some fair number of them become addicts. If doctors, right? They're always like, they get this stuff. And
nurses too. Nurses are like
nurses,
way into pharmaceuticals.
Oh my God, totally. Access to the drug cabinet. I mean,
yeah.
They all have drug drawers in their house, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but the doctors, they have the highest rate of recovery because their licenses they're gonna take away their license.
Right.
And it's like, here you make $250,000 a year and you will lose it all if you don't quit your cocaine, heroin, laudanum, or whatever habit you're on, fentanyl. And they quit because they have some reason to quit. So that's like, yeah. So, I mean, look, millions of people, I always point out, most people don't do drugs. The people that do drugs, most don't become addicts. The people who become addicts, most of them are able to quit on their own. And the small number that can't quit on their own are able to quit with some sort of a family or governmental intervention. So the idea that somehow like you're just you became addicted. Well, that's it for you. Hook you up to the IV and you're a vegetable for life. It's such a pessimistic and wrong view of that disorder. And it's a disorder. I mean, these are like disorders, like eating disorders. I mean, it's like I have so many women in my life who had eating disorders, so many Gen Xers. It was like every other woman.
Yeah. Bulimia was very popular in that generation.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause it's a quick fix. You can still enjoy a good meal,
Yeah. So easy.
Yeah. But anorexia, that's why I was going to go. Yeah. These girls that have gender dysphoria today, they had, if it was like the 80s or 90s, they would have had anorexia.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do you think is behind addiction? I mean, there's been like various, I guess, accepted understandings of addiction, like AA. I don't know if AA still pushes this so hard, but I think that AA was based on this idea that it was a disease. Like, well, you have a disease and you have a disease for life and that's it for you. And then I've read, like Gabor Mate wrote a book, the Hungry Ghost, something about that. I mean, he worked on the Downtown East Side for many, many years, and he said, and this made more sense to me, that it was all rooted in childhood trauma and your brain kind of got rewired. You need to rewire your brain in a different way. I'm sure a lot of it's related to mental health stuff. I mean, what do you think? Like, why do some people get like you just said, a lot of people use drugs. I think everybody I know uses drugs, or at least has used drugs. And I don't know a lot of addicts.
By the way, that proves that you're a liberal, by the way, because if you were really conservative, you would know nobody who did drugs. When I talk to conservatives, because sometimes you kind of go, wow, are we all the liberals, the world is becoming conservative? And then you realize, it's still totally different worlds. I mean, I'm not saying conservatives never smoke weed, or there's certainly alcoholism, but I think that...
I think they think drugs are bad, and I don't think drugs are bad.
No. Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of conversation around psychedelics. I mean, obviously, like you have periods of, you had a lot of child trauma in periods of human history and in places, and no drug addiction. So that can't be a complete explanation. At the same time, boy, when you interview people on the street whose addiction has led them to be homeless, or you talk to addicts, it's like their childhoods were usually terrible. That being said, I mean, in San Fransicko, I profiled 2 homeless addicts, one black, one white. And neither of them, they both said they were spoiled as kids. They were kind of babied, and, so, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of narcissism. Like you can get like hardcore narcissism. I do think is a result of having been abused or neglected as a child in some ways, or been kind of manipulated by your parents. Narcissistic parents can create narcissistic kids. Hurt people. But these little cliches are totally true.
Mantras always help.
Well, the worst thing about getting older is you're like, God, another cliche that's totally accurate. Crap.
Totally. Like, I guess there's a reason why that's a cliche.
Yeah. But I do think, yeah, so I mean, some of that, so it's a very paradoxical thing, because there's a way in which it's like kids need just the right amount of stress. They need just the right amount of adversity. Malcolm Gladwell did a really good job explaining this in his book Outliers, but certainly I see it too, where it's like you get too coddled and too spoiled and you become a narcissist and an addict, and you kind of tell me how great I am. Tell me how great. Oh, and we see this generationally, like, well, why don't I get more praise for this? Because you didn't earn it, or because you were given praise too much for shit you didn't. Oh my God, you drew with crayons. Who fucking cares? Like, save the recognition and rewards for real achievement, and for really having done the hard work. So I do think some of it comes from trauma, but there hasn't been an increase in childhood trauma. And I think the evidence suggests there's been a decrease in childhood trauma. I was able to point to some evidence. It's very spotty, but there was some evidence showing a decline in child abuse. I mean, you just look at the stigma against spanking your kids. I mean, when we were kids,
which is very new. That's a very modern idea that you can't do that.
I mean, we went from like going out back and dad was going to pull like a wood stick and pull your pants down and like whip you until your ass was bleeding. I mean, we've gone from that to where I got spanked twice. I remember both of them. I think my parents were more traumatized than I was, and it was just a kind of swat on the ass, and it was all crying and tears and everything after that. I was mostly coddled. I had just enough adversity as a child to escape it. But I think that's the bigger challenge, is just that you've got a lot of kids that think that have not had the appropriate amounts of adversity or parenting. That's, why we see, sadly, fatherless boys and girls too, growing up without daddies means they're not getting that discipline that they need. And I think that then they end up slipping into some psychiatric disorders, including substance use disorder.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And yeah, because I was just watching a documentary last night on Xanax, and just like a Netflix documentary. And I think that most of the addiction is actually not with these like hard drugs, like these street drugs. Of course, there's like a huge fentanyl problem, but as I understand it, much of that fentanyl problem came from prescriptions, like from Oxy. And so people became addicted to Oxycontin, and then they needed to go out on the street and get it, and then they couldn't get it, and so they moved to fentanyl or heroin or whatever. But I mean, tons and tons of young people, I think, like millennials or Gen Z, and this wasn't common when I was growing up, are addicted to like Adderall, like addicted to speed, and addicted to all sorts of, anti-anxiety pills and stuff like that. And I don't think that any of these people had hard childhoods. I mean, maybe some of them did, but they're generally like pretty privileged, like you say, like coddled people who had good lives.
Yeah, and some of those, the elites that are using Adderall are probably going to be fine. They're going to need to quit their Adderall addiction. And, I mean, I've been getting a lot of benefit from, day sunlight before I take, exercise. I mean, sadly, God, talk about depressing but true things. You're like, wow, so it turns out exercise is really, it's like another
Don't
study.
Forget to get all of your vitamins and get some sunlight and get some exercise and get a good night's sleep.
I know, you're like, God damn it. That's all it was the whole time, and so, yeah, I mean, the speed, God, we could talk for hours about speed and meth, but yeah, I mean, I think the other, my friend, I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and she talks about how she just thinks that a lot of people that would just benefit from an antidepressant self-medicate with other drugs, so we don't have enough psychiatric care. So I think some of that, I mean, maybe it's less so in Canada, but we just don't do a good job of psychiatric care. So I think all of these things are factors in it, definitely quick fix culture, I mean,
I tend to think that, I'm sort of I don't know if I'm a fair critic because I've never really struggled with any serious mental health issues. So I don't understand on a personal level things like anxiety disorders or serious depression that goes on and on and on for years. You know, obviously I've been depressed when bad things have happened. But I tend to think that a lot of these people who think that they're depressed or think that they have anxiety, again, could just benefit from things like getting exercise really helps a lot. Like, I never really worked out very much in my life until lately, and I'm like, wow, I always I hate doing it. I never want to go, and after I'm like, oh, I feel great. I feel so much. If I'm in a bad mood before I go to the gym, once I leave, I'm in a great mood.
Oh God, I'm the same way. I am absolutely the same way. I just, you have to, I think we have to train ourselves to just lean into some of that pain and suffering. Anna Lemke, I'm obsessed with the Stanford has 3 professors of psychology and psychiatry who I think are the best in the country right now. And it's Anna Lemke.
I recognize that name. What book did she write?
She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation.
Okay, right. I have that on my list to read.
And that book is like, well, so it's, they all kind of go together. I mean, it's Anna Lemke, Andrew Huberman, who's like the light, and he's all about light and exercise, and Keith Humphreys, and we're all friendlies, you know, because I think there's a way. I think I'm one of the things I'm interested in right now, I haven't done a lot on it, is I think that you might remember there was a funny article, I think it was in New Republic or Salon or some really terrible woke publication that was like, oh God, all these alt-right reactionaries are praising exercise. How terrible that was.
Right. Going to the gym is like a Nazi thing now. I think.
And I was thinking more, I was like, you know, they're like health, like physical and mental health is a really good kind of core value to start with.
Yeah.
Because I do think there's something absolutely pathological, not just about having sick people living on the street and doing drugs as homeless people, but there's something wrong with you if you think that's okay. In the same way, there's something wrong with you if you think it's okay to start a 14-year-old girl on puberty blockers after she's had gender dysphoria for 2 months, you know, and has multiple other psychiatric disorders. Like, there's something wrong with you. Like, if you're that like ideological or dogmatic, whereas, like, you know, one of the things that happens after you run or exercise, do some kind of physical exercise, is I just think your thinking is better too. You're more open-minded. You see different sides of things. You're less angry. You're less anxious, you know? So I do think there's some relationship between these psychiatric disorder, the increased psychiatric disorders, and the declining physical health of our population.
Yeah. And, you know, that idea that if a doctor tells a woman, you know, like, you really need to think about losing weight because this is bad for your health, this is dangerous, that's unacceptable or an insult or shaming or judgmental. I mean, it's like that's what your doctor's job is. And I think that a lot of doctors these days are doing a pretty bad job of taking care of people's health in genuine ways. And we can see that through this, like, okay, well, here's a pill, and they're not talking about nutrition or exercise or any of these things. But if a doctor does say, like, you know, you're obese, like, you're overweight, this is bad for your health, that's, you know, they're trying to help. That's not a harmful thing. And to treat that as a harmful thing because of this ideology is very strange.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think it's another area where, you know, the kind of pathological woke religion is it's reversing traditional. So if you kind of go, health is eating right and remaining fit and getting your exercise, they'll just reverse it and say, oh no, that's pathological, and the healthy thing is to be whatever weight you want, and it's all socially constructed, and it's just getting bizarre.
And the excuses about not exercising, like, oh, well, it's really hard to exercise. I saw an article the other day that was basically implying that it was racist to expect people to exercise because gyms aren't accessible to people of color. Like, you know, really out there.
Literally, running shoes are, so first of all, many poor people have very nice shoes, by the way. But literally a pair of running shoes and running it's just close to being free. A pair of running shoes that cost like $60 can last you for like 2 years. So yeah, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just a joke. Like sports and exercise are like some of the cheapest activities are in our society. So.
Yeah, and things like sports. I mean, I tend to do my exercising on my own, but things like sports are great because you've combined the like community, the socializing, the exercise, the fun, the camaraderie, and yeah,
Yes.
it's really strange what the woke left has attached itself to because again, as I think that they think of themselves just like I thought of myself in this way when I was like a hardcore leftist as the people who care about people, but then their entire ideology seems very like anti-people.
It's very, yeah, it's pro people, like it's ideological, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking the Andrew Huberman and you were mentioning this, like you're supposed to get daylight. I think you're supposed to get daylight in the morning, right? You're supposed to get sunlight in the morning. And
Yep.
I'm nocturnal, so I'm like working until 2 a.m. I go to bed at like 3:30 in the morning and I wake up at noon. And my trainer is really into Andrew Huberman and he's always telling me that I need to wake up in the morning and get morning daylight. And if he listens to this, he's going to be he's like, I told you that. I told you that.
Yeah, I love. I bought for the first time a daylight lamp. You know, for like sun. I do still go get morning sunlight when I run, and then I bought this daylight, and I love it. I'm bummed it took me 51 years to figure out that I had seasonal affective disorder. I mean, speaking of disorders and also not shaming them, I mean, you kind of go, I have seasonal affective disorder and I'm treating it with my day lamp. You know, and people are always like, oh, it also CBT helps. I do CBT. I've been doing CBT for, years. I do it on my runs. You know, I do it when I'm in a bad mood, talk back to it, eating right. But these are things that we should talk about and promote. Because I think they're just these really liberating tools that are available for all of us. I mean, here we all make fun of it, but we have this thing called a self-help movement, which is literally about not being under somebody else's thumb. It's about freeing yourself and taking control of your life. And it's there's certainly a bunch of hucksters and bad stuff there, but it's not hard to sort them out. And the goal is to liberate yourself from your own bad habits and also from unhealthy behaviors, but also from oppressive people in your life. And so, yeah, the ways in which that gets condemned by the woke left is sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and blaming the victim. It's just terrible. I mean, that was one of the questions I had when I wrote San Fransicko was, how did people that are, because people in the self-help movement or the human potential movement, they're like Oprah liberals, they're like all about like making my life better. But then they got swept up in this idea that it's all about blaming the victim and victimhood ideology. And I was very curious about it. How do you go from really celebrating personal empowerment to celebrating victimhood? That strikes me as a very hard, you should not be so easy to convert people that are committed to self-improvement to embracing such a noxious ideology of victimhood, identitarian woke movements.
Yeah, the idea of empowerment has gotten really skewed and strange because it seems to me to be not about empowerment, but sort of about like not being critical of yourself or not challenging yourself and like live and live, but in a toxic way. I mean, it's
not live and let live though, right? It's totally moralistic and judgmental.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's actually like, you say this or we're coming for you.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that it's been like an hour and a half. Do you have to get going or do you have a little bit more time?
Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna ask you about the prostitution trafficking stuff that you did, but we can shelf that because this is probably a good place to end also.
Sure. I mean, we can do one more thing on sex trafficking.
Okay. I mean, I think that I was really appreciative that you published that article about trafficking and about legalization in San Francisco, because again, I don't know any progressives or leftists who don't advocate for legalization. And the mantra is sex work is work, it's a job like any other. And the entire problem with abuse, exploitation, trafficking is that it's not legal. And what we need to do is legalize, bring it all out into the open and regulate. And I mean, you in your journalism, I think, did a very good job of sort of showing how that's not true. What did you find when you were looking into the traffic situation in San Francisco and this idea that, you know, legalization will help?
Well, all credit to my co-author, Leighton Woodhouse, who really was ahead of me on this issue. I had not thought about prostitution at all. I probably had a pretty naive view of it. I'm very steeped in drug culture, obviously, or maybe not obviously. And as soon as I understood that it was actually part of the drugs, I mean, in other words, the girls that are being trafficked by drug dealers. So it's all in the same protection racket of MS-13. I think it was an interesting experience because we were sort of on a ride along with these former officers. They're now PIs, and they told us about the girl on the first ride along, and then we went back a second night, and we were like, "What's going on with the girl?" And they were like, "Oh, you know, we can't see. We tried to get her, we couldn't get her." And we were like, "That's fucked up," and we're gonna write a story on it like right now. You know, like I think with the child, it felt really urgent to get her off the street as soon as possible. And so we focused on that. We came home because there's a lot of people on the street, you know, a lot of young people, but a girl that was like, come on, you know. So we emailed the police station, police officer, the assistant chief got right back to us within a couple of hours. He was like, I have a 15-year-old daughter. I care about this. It was a very, you know, they got her off the street in part because of our reporting. And it felt super, super satisfying because, you know, when you're a public intellectual or a journalist, you don't always see the results of your work. And in this case we did. And we both, yeah, I mean, and then you kind of go, well, it's not like anything magical happens when you turn 18.
Yeah.
I think one thing is, you know, what do you do about it? I mean, the reaction from a lot of our readers who tend to be more libertarian is, you know, kind of the classic reaction, which is, you know, oldest profession, you know, what are you going to do? Or do women not have a, you know, what if she's a 35-year-old sober, you know, people always come with some example where you're like, yeah, I don't think that. I kind of come to the same place that I do with a lot of the other stuff, which is I'm just very kind of practical in the sense of, you know, well, we can all agree that a 14-year-old girl should not be sex trafficked. Okay, so we can agree on that. And then you get to older folks and you go, well, you don't want street prostitution, and you don't want people being drugged and enslaved. So I've been looking at these. I'm curious your view. We've been looking at these countries that have focused on criminalizing the Johns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
not the sex workers, not the prostitutes. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, so that's what I've been advocating for many years now. It's referred to sometimes as the Nordic model, and so Sweden has been operating on this model for quite a long time now, like since like 1999 or something like that. And they've had success, and you know, prostitution isn't going away. I'm not naive. You can't actually fully get rid of prostitution, I don't think. But you can curb demand. And what they did accomplish with the Nordic model in Sweden is that they curbed demand. So there's a lot less men who are buying sex. And what, of course, we have seen in countries that legalize, like Germany, is that trafficking blows up because when it's legalized, there's more demand, and then you need more prostitutes. And I'm sorry, the truth is that most women and girls, of course, in the world don't want to be in prostitution. So you do have to coerce or, you know, bring them in from elsewhere and sort of keep them without any other options because women don't want to do that. And so, and you know, the Nordic model, what's meant to happen is that, yeah, they criminalize the Johns, criminalize the brothel owners, criminalize the pimps, decriminalize the women so that you're not, you know, punishing the victim. And it does seem to have been successful. So, I mean, that's the best that I've seen and that I can come up with. I don't know that I've ever seen or heard of a better alternative or model.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. It's funny. It's actually, you might call it harm reduction.
Yeah.
Except for it's better than that. But
I mean,
it's
it would be great if, in addition, and I think that they have tried to do this in Sweden, but in addition, you should be trying to get the women off the street. Like, you should be providing them with resources and help to leave prostitution. Like, the problem with harm reduction, which has been the approach in places like San Francisco and in places like Vancouver, both in terms of addiction and in terms of prostitution, it's harm reduction, but that in action means you're giving out condoms and sandwiches and then leaving these women or addicts out on the street.
No, I agree. It's different. It's more like it's much more similar to the approach of drugs. Like I always point out, like I don't want to go like tracking down people in their homes who are using drugs peacefully in their homes. But if your addiction has led you to be like on a tent in the middle of the sidewalk in downtown San Francisco and you're having to perform sex work in order to make money for your drugs and commit theft, then you should be arrested and mandated treatment because it's gone so far. But I think one of the ways that people strawman this issue, sex work or sex trafficking, I should say, and drugs, is they kind of go, oh, well, but you'll never get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's fine. Like, we don't have to get rid of it. We can't get rid of murder, but we can reduce it very significantly. And it's not by legalizing it.
No. And I mean, and the other thing I should add actually is that in terms of this model in Sweden, part of what they accomplished also was that prostitution isn't seen as like an okay thing. Like it's not socially acceptable to pay for sex. Whereas I think if you go somewhere like Germany or Amsterdam or Nevada, it is. Like, I think that it's seen as totally normal and accepted and just part of the party for dudes. And I think that's important too. Like, I think that there should be this cultural or social idea that it's frowned upon, that it's shameful, that it's an unethical practice. I mean, we'll never stop it, but I don't think that means that we pretend that it's a good thing or an ethical thing, because it's not.
I agree.
I will let you go because I've taken up a lot of your time, but I really super enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
Yeah.
Let's stay friends. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Take care.
Nice to meet you.
Bye. Nice to meet you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.